Johann Sebastian Bach spent much of his life teaching. His pupils included his own children, professional musicians, university students and gifted amateurs. Some went on to become distinguished composers. Others simply wanted to become better musicians. Yet Bach never wrote a book explaining how music should be taught. There were no lectures, no educational treatises. Instead, he left something far more interesting: the music he wrote for his pupils. A notebook for his eldest son, Wilhelm Friedemann, another for Anna Magdalena, the Inventions and Sinfonias, the Well-Tempered Clavier. For years, I thought of these as separate collections, written for different people at different moments in Bach's life. But the more I spent with them, the harder it became to keep them separate in my mind. After a while, I stopped wondering why Bach had written these collections. Instead, I found myself wondering whether, taken together, they were saying something much bigger about how musicians learn. I couldn't hear Bach's music in quite the same way afterwards, and it left me with a question: what did Bach really want every musician to learn? If Bach never explained how he taught, where do we look? My instinct was to look beyond the biographies and go straight to the music, or more precisely, to the manuscripts. This notebook was begun in 1720 for Bach's eldest son, Wilhelm Friedemann. The first time I spent any real time with it, something became obvious. I wasn't looking at a finished publication. I was looking at a working lesson book. Its pages contain music by Bach, music by other composers, exercises, and early versions of works that would later become some of his greatest keyboard pieces. It feels less like a textbook than an invitation into Bach's workshop. Other collections followed: the notebook for Anna Magdalena Bach, the Inventions and Sinfonias, the Well-Tempered Clavier. They were written over many years, for different pupils and under very different circumstances. At first they seemed quite separate, but after a while I started noticing the same things cropping up. Not the same pieces, the same musical thinking, the same priorities, the same way of hearing. It made me realise that teaching wasn't something Bach did alongside composing. It ran through almost everything he wrote. His own children learnt with him. So did pupils such as Johann Ludwig Krebs, Johann Friedrich Agricola, and Johann Christoph Alpnickel, musicians who would later establish distinguished careers of their own. One thing I hadn't expected was how little explanation these books contain. Very few written instructions. Hardly any pages of theory. Almost no attempt to explain what the student should do. Instead, Bach lets the music teach. The more I looked at these manuscripts, the more remarkable they seemed. They're much more than collections of pieces. They're a record of the things Bach thought every musician should learn. So where did he begin? As it turns out, the answer is surprisingly simple. He began with music. If this notebook is where Bach begins, the obvious question is, where does the first lesson begin? Not with scales, not with pages of finger exercises, not with rules of harmony. It begins with music. When I first spent time with this notebook, that genuinely surprised me. I'd expected Bach to begin with technique. Instead, he begins with listening. And once I'd noticed that, I couldn't really look at these pages in quite the same way. Listen to what's happening here. Each hand has its own line. Neither exists simply to accompany the other. If one voice takes over, something disappears. The music suddenly feels much flatter. One line speaks, the other falls silent. Now listen again. The two voices begin to answer one another. You stop hearing two hands. You start hearing two musical ideas. That feels like a small difference. It isn't. The same thing happens with articulation. Play every note in exactly the same way, and the music quickly loses its shape. Give every phrase a little direction, and suddenly the lines begin to breathe. Even the fingering seems to serve a bigger purpose, not simply getting from one note to the next, helping the music move naturally. The more I worked through these pages, the less it felt as though Bach was teaching one skill after another. Everything seemed to grow together. Touch, balance, listening, understanding. None of them stands on its own. Each grows out of the music. If there's a first lesson here, I think it's this. Technique and musicianship aren't separate things. For Bach, they begin together. Once I began to see that, this stopped looking like a beginner's notebook. It started to feel like a first step in a way of thinking that runs through Bach's whole life. A few years later, Bach brought together another collection for his pupils, the Inventions and Sinfonias. This time he included a short preface. It's only a few sentences long, but they become some of the most important words Bach ever wrote about teaching. He says these pieces were written to help students play clearly in 2 and 3 voices, to develop musical ideas, and to acquire what he calls a Cantabile style, a singing style. I've been thinking about those 2 words for years. They're easy enough to read, much harder to put into practice. After all, a keyboard can't sustain a note like a violin or a singer. The sound begins to fade almost as soon as it's made. So how do you make it sing? Listen to this opening phrase. Everything is technically correct. The notes are there, the rhythm is there, nothing is obviously wrong. And yet, it never quite comes to life. Nothing on the page has changed. Exactly the same notes, exactly the same rhythm, but the relationship between the notes is completely different. Some lean forwards, others relax. The phrase begins to breathe. It starts to sound less like notes on a page, and more like someone speaking. That took me a long time to appreciate. I used to think expression was something performers added to the music. Now I'm not so sure. The more time I've spent with these manuscripts, the more it feels as though the expression is already there. Our job is simply to uncover it. And it isn't only the melody. Listen to the bass, now the inner voice. Each has its own direction, its own shape, its own character. The more carefully I listened, the more I realized I wasn't hearing more notes. I was hearing more conversations. The whole texture became richer, not because I was playing differently, but because I was hearing differently. Perhaps that's why I keep coming back to these pieces. Every return seems to reveal something I've overlooked before. There's one sentence in this preface that kept drawing me back. Bach hoped these pieces would give his pupils, in his own words, a strong foretaste of composition. For a long time I assumed he meant composition as a separate discipline, learning to write music. Now I'm not so sure. I think he may have meant something much broader, not simply learning to play the notes, but beginning to understand how the music grows, how one idea leads naturally to the next. Take this opening phrase. It's easy to hear it as a succession of notes, but listen a little more closely. There's an idea here. Now listen to what happens next. It comes back, not simply repeated, but developed. It grows, it shifts, it finds a new harmony, then another. Everything seems to grow naturally out of what came before. The first time I really heard that happening, something changed. I stopped listening bar by bar. I started listening to where the music was going. The cadences no longer felt like places to stop. They became places the music had been aiming for all along. The phrasing suddenly felt much clearer. And once I'd heard the piece that way, I couldn't really go back. The same habit of thinking appears everywhere. In the well-tempered clavier, in the partitas, in the art of fugue. Again and again, Bach begins with the simplest musical idea, and lets it unfold into something much larger. Then another thought crept in. Perhaps Bach wasn't trying to turn performers into composers. Perhaps he wanted performers to hear music the way a composer hears it. Not so they could write it, but so they could understand it from the inside. And that was the point where my original question quietly disappeared. I started this project wondering how Bach taught. Now I found myself asking something rather different. What was he really trying to teach? The more I thought about it, the less I believed the answer was keyboard playing. I think Bach was teaching musicians how to listen. Let's go back to the music we heard at the beginning. The notes haven't changed, but I don't hear them in quite the same way. The phrases seem to have somewhere they're trying to go. The voices answer one another. Small musical ideas gradually grow into something much larger. Nothing on a page is different. The music itself is exactly the same. The only thing that's changed is the way I'm listening. Over the past few months, I spent far more time with these manuscripts than I ever expected. And every time I came back to them, I noticed something new. Not a hidden code, not some forgotten historical detail, just another way of hearing the music. That's why I no longer think of these books simply as collections of teaching pieces. They feel much more like invitations to listen more carefully, not just for beginners, for all of us. Perhaps that's why Bach's music never seems exhausted. The notes stay the same, but our ears keep changing. I don't think Bach was simply trying to teach his pupils how to play. I think he wanted them to understand how music grows, how one idea leads naturally to another, how every phrase belongs to something larger than itself. Once you begin to hear that, it changes the way you play, and it changes the way you listen. I began this project hoping to understand how Bach taught. I finished it hearing his music differently. Perhaps that's the closest we'll ever come to understanding his lesson.